Zooming recording. And so a message probably popped up on your screen. So welcome to the Global Studies webinar on the US and the global in the US. And as I just said, we are recording today. The recording will be shared on our YouTube channel and website. So if you know anybody who wasn't able to be here today, we will be sharing that. My name is Paul Gellert, and I'm the Director of Global Studies and Associate Professor of Sociology here at the University of Tennessee. This is the third in a series of interdisciplinary events that we are organizing this year and next on the theme, the US and the global in the US, a view from the Southeast periphery. First of all, I want to quickly thank all of our sponsors. We've had great support for this, first and foremost from the Haynes Morris Endowment Fund, also from the Center for Global Engagement, whose staff have helped us to put together the flyers and publicity, the departments of Sociology, History, Political Science, and Anthropology, and a number of interdisciplinary programs in Africana Studies, Asian Studies, Latin American, Caribbean Studies, and Middle East Studies. And I've been working closely with a committee with Tore Olsson, who's going to lead today, Asafa Jalata, Tamara Gilbertson, and two undergrad Global Studies Club co-presidents, Calista Boyd and Lily Hardwick. Just a minute to share that our first roundtable back in October, which is on our YouTube channel, was on COVID. Timely, it was our first webinar, might as well talk about COVID. Our second was about the US South in the globe with Nan Enstad, Brandon Bird, and Bart Elmore, and maybe some of you were at that. Today is a follow-up to that, so that one was looking outward from the South. This is looking from inward from the globe to the South. And we're going to follow up on March 5th with a session organized by Dr. Megan Conley, who is a professor of practice and director of community partnerships in the Department of Sociology, with 4 activists speaking about criminalization of immigrants and how communities resist. And then on March 12th, we will have a panel that I've organized with Dr. Asafa Jalata in sociology about US intervention in the globe with experts on 3 different regions of the world to look at the past and present of intervention. So I'll put those links in the chat as well. A couple other things before I turn the screen over to Tore. We are running this, as you can see, as a Zoom meeting and not a webinar. And the great advantage of that is that we can see faces, which I personally prefer quite a bit to the webinar where you don't know who's in the room, so to speak. That being said, there's going to be a formal segment of this in which Tore is going to lead some question and answer with our panel. And I'll ask you to please mute and turn off your screen during that session, that part of the session, because as far as I understand Zoom and my experience with it, the recording then will have only the people whose cameras are on. And when we put it up on the website, we'll see those 4 people, and that makes for a really nice viewing. And then when we get to the more open discussion, if you turn your cameras back on to participate in that, that would be terrific. During this, I will also, we have a great crowd. I see over 30 people here right now. I will try to help monitor the chat. So if you have questions during the discussion, then I will keep track of those and try to help get to all the questions and comments that you have. And finally, I'm going to turn it over to Tore Olsson from the Department of History to kick us off.
Terrific. Thanks, Paul. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you all with us today for our distinguished speakers and to everyone in the audience. Really thrilled that you all are here. Thanks, Paul, for the introduction. And I want to thank also Daisy Shen in the Center for Global Engagement for her help in advertising and publicizing the event. Much appreciated. So today's topic is the global in the US South. And as Paul mentioned, this is the second event in a series on the place of the American South in the larger world surrounding us. Some of you guys were able to join us back in November for our first event in this series when we hosted 3 scholars who studied how people and institutions from the US South reached out into the larger world, whether those were corporations, politicians, or crusaders for or against social justice, among others, across this broad span of time, around a century and a half. But in that November conversation, we talked a lot about the South's outward globalism, and we heard much less about how the South itself was reshaped by forces outside of the United States. That, of course, is going to be our very precise topic today. And today we're going to hear primarily about immigration as a force for transforming and redefining the US South as a place. And really, I believe that there's very few other phenomena that have had a greater impact in shifting the boundaries of regional Southern identity in recent time. Because let's keep in mind that 50 years ago, let's say 1970 or so, the South was an overwhelmingly it was inhabited overwhelmingly by Black and white people whose parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had probably resided within the region itself. The percentage of foreign-born population in the South 50 years ago was in most states less than 1%. Today, that world looks fundamentally different. And in fact, the South has led the nation in recent decades as the quickest growing destination for immigrants across the entire United States, something that would have been quite unthinkable 50 or 100 years earlier. So today we're joined by three scholars from three very separate disciplines who are at the forefront of understanding what this transformation has meant. And I'm really honored to begin today by introducing the three of them. And I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. First off, I'm really delighted to introduce Professor Jennifer Jones. Dr. Jones is an associate professor of sociology and Latin American and Latino studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She is the author of a terrific new book that's called The Browning of the New South, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2019. Thank you so much for joining us, Jennifer.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. Second, I'd like to introduce Professor Uzma Karaishi. Dr. Karaishi is an associate professor of history at Sam Houston State University, and she is the author of another terrific recent book, which is called Redefining the Immigrant South: Indian and Pakistani Immigration to Houston During the Cold War, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press just a few months ago, back in 2020. And I'll say Professor Karaishi is, of course, in Houston, which, as you know, is in the middle of some serious issues, to say the least, at the moment. So she will be joining us via her phone. There will be no video for her, unfortunately, because her internet is out. She thankfully has electricity and water, but she'll be joining via phone. So Uzma, thank you, and it's great to have you here. Last of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Angela Stuesse. Dr. Stuesse is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is the author of a wonderful book that came out quite recently called Scratching Out a Living: Latinos, Race, and Work in the Deep South, which was published by the University of California Press in 2016. And I'll say, Angela, it's terrific to have you here. And I'll say, too, that each of the three books of these three scholars has been absolutely vital in my own rethinking of this changing South. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have you three with us today. So with introductions done, let me turn to our format before I shut up and let the guests do the real talking. Our format today is going to be a true roundtable session, which means that I'll serve as moderator. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a series of 3 questions of our distinguished guests. And each of them is going to have a maximum of 5 minutes to respond to each of those questions. We'll do one question at a time and move through it. So technically, we'll take the first 45 minutes of our session with the 3 panelists responding to these 3 questions in 5 minutes each. After that, we're going to open the floor to the audience and take questions and answers and have a broader discussion. But with all that said, let me turn and pose the very first question to our 3 guests. And we'll move in alphabetical order with Jennifer, then Uzma, then Angela after that. So let me start off by asking you guys the first question, and I'll repeat it so the audience can chew on it for a bit. each of you, the three scholars, each of you has studied distinct immigrant groups within the modern South. What were or are the greatest challenges and opportunities that your group of study confronted as they entered the South? I'll repeat that. Each of you has studied distinct immigrant groups within the modern South. What were or are the greatest challenges and opportunities that your group of study confronted as they entered the region? So I will kick it to Jennifer first off.
Sure. Thanks for that question. I think, in some ways it is in kind of ongoing cycle of issues that folks have faced that I'm sure that Uzma and Angela can have a lot to say about. My work has focused primarily on Mexican origin immigrants in North Carolina, and as well as others from Latin American origin, but primarily when I was conducting my fieldwork for the book in sort of 2009, 2010, a lot of those folks were primarily Mexican origin. And then in recent years, I've been doing work in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, looking more broadly at immigration issues, still kind of focused on Latinos more broadly, but also taking into account other groups as well who've settled in the region. And I would say a lot of the issues faced by newcomers at the time are similar to what's happening today, just on a smaller scale. So many of my informants were terrified about a new regime in North Carolina in which 287G became a very popular mechanism through which to regulate immigrant bodies, and was specifically targeted in lots of ways at Latinx populations. And that was a clause that essentially deputized local law enforcement to be able to put people in deportation proceedings for kind of minimal infractions, often being picked up for violating various kind of traffic laws for the most part, but sometimes checkpoints and other issues. And so for them, they came to the South, to the region, because there were job opportunities, because the cost of living was lower. Many of them were from rural areas and small towns, and the sort of lifestyle was much more suited to their likes. It was warmer than many of the places they were coming from, had they settled sort of initially in the Northeast as an option. And so they thought they were doing just fine. And then suddenly, kind of around 2005, 2006, the climate around immigration changed quite a bit in not just North Carolina, but kind of the region as a whole. And so they faced a lot of backlash in terms of both the way that people were treating them on the street, the kind of discourse that was being bandied around elections, around Obama's election and local elections, but also in terms of policy, things like 287G, but also policies to exclude immigrants from accessing public education and the community college system, policies that would limit the number of people who could live in a home, policies that were intended to try to restrict the kinds of healthcare people could get access to. So a number of things that made their lives difficult. And as you know, in the South, it's not easy to get around without a car. So the combination of driving being a risky behavior meant that it was difficult to work, it was difficult to take children to school and appointments. And so fear really was the thing that was difficult for immigrants who had settled in the area. And I think that in some ways, we've come back to that moment in the Trump administration. Certainly a lot of the things that were pioneered in the South in terms of anti-immigrant policies and politics were kind of expanded to a national level, in no small part because of the promotion of some of those very same legislators to the national scene. So we saw, Jeff Sessions, who had done a lot of work in Alabama to pass HB 56, move to the national scene and try to pass similar laws. And so really, I would say the hardest thing for them was not that they were undocumented per se, because I think up into that period, people were doing fine. They were able to get jobs. Of course, there are always restrictions that come with being undocumented, but it was relatively safe for them. And suddenly it was all about sort of fear of deportation and detention and the kind of backlash and harassment that they were suddenly facing from neighbors. And so that was really kind of what sparked a lot of the work that I did in North Carolina at the time. I think in some ways this was shared across groups with a Latin American origin, so not just Mexicans, but Central Americans as well. Less so, I think, with those of Asian origin at the time, but that has changed, and I'm sure that Uzma's book highlights some of the ways in which South Asians and others have faced backlash in recent years. And so I think now we're seeing that kind of feeling of fear and backlash expanding, but also opportunities in that for solidarity that I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit. So I'll end there and turn it over to my fellow panelists.
Uzma, if you want to give it a go, that'd be great.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. This interface on my phone isn't as user-friendly as I hoped it would be. All right, I am glad to be here. I'm so excited about this conversation and talking about this. In spite of everything that's going on here in Texas, it's sort of a bit of an oasis of calm in the midst of everything that people are facing here. So to talk about the challenges and the opportunities, the group of immigrants that I study is Indian and Pakistani immigrants who arrived in Texas in the late 1950s, but also but especially in the 60s and the 70s. And I would say the greatest challenge that they faced was racial discrimination, even in the 70s. And here I am tooting my own horn, but there's an article that I've written specifically on this topic, as opposed to the book, which is sort of a massive examination of the entire immigration process. But I focus specifically on race in an article that's in the Journal of American Ethnic History in 2019 that came out, if you're interested in learning more. But what they faced was, I think, heightened feelings of alienation, and any immigrant, and honestly, any native-born American can feel those things when moving from one place to another. Those feelings aren't unique to immigrants, but the particular feelings of alienation that Asian immigrants felt in the 70s and moving even into today, I think are a result of a particular kind of othering. In fact, a perpetual foreignness, as other scholars have noticed. And this is really the living legacy of an entire structure of immigration policy, right? Immigration law. So starting in the 1870s with the Page Law, the US at the federal level, as well as at the state level, began passing laws and handing down rulings at every court level that governed marriage for Asian immigrants, that governed their ability to eventually enter the United States. And so by the 1880s, the first set of laws that barred Chinese from entry into the United States were set. And then that was then replicated in other laws. And by 1917, all Asians were then denied permission to settle in the United States. Why do I bring this up? That same set of laws also denied Asian residents who were not born in the US, who were foreign born. It denied them the ability to naturalize as citizens. So they could never become citizens. And many lived and died here, never having obtained citizenship. Essentially, they were not fit to be American, and they felt this. So this changed in 1965. There was a complete overhaul of immigration law, and these racial origins quotas were removed. The bars to citizenship were removed, and Asians could once again enter the country like other immigrants could. So the law changed, but that law in 65 was really a law of unintended consequences. And what we mean by that is that when that law was passed, the intention was not to fundamentally alter the number of Asian immigrants in the US. So essentially, the sentiment and the attitude towards Asian Americans hadn't changed one bit. What had changed was this concern about what this looks like in the Cold War era, and especially in the Civil Rights era, right? A nation that denies a group of people, a massive group, it's not even a group, just an entire continent of people entry into the US on the basis of race, that doesn't make for good politics. And so even though that law was passed, What I found in my research is that immigrants who came in the 1960s and 1970s continued to face this same kind of othering that had been present in the decades that preceded it. It's not as though passage of a law suddenly changes attitudes overnight. And in fact, those attitudes haven't changed even now, because even now, as recently as a week or two ago, we see Asian Americans in Oakland, California, who are being attacked and blamed once again for this pandemic, this coronavirus, right? And we've seen this spate of hate crimes against Asian and Asian immigrants and Asian Americans during this entire pandemic. So you still see it surface. Going back to my work in the 1960s and 70s, the specific kinds of racial discrimination that Asian immigrants faced, that Indians and Pakistanis faced, was discrimination in the ability to rent housing and a glass ceiling at work. So where they found ways of purchasing houses, they often faced a lot of trouble renting homes. And so as soon as a landlord saw them, suddenly that rental unit was not available. What are you talking about? And so they'd have to find ways of circumventing this discrimination in order to find a place to live. In terms of opportunities, well, quite frankly, they had a high level of education. They were able to come to the U.S. And because, especially post 65, they couldn't sort of overtly be discriminated against in terms of admission to universities, they obtained higher education. They were able to get jobs, good jobs. So they were able to build financial capital in a way that other racialized groups were not able to do, even in those same years. And the other opportunity that I say they create is the creation of a thick ethnic identity, because ethnic spaces were safe spaces, whereas in other spaces they would have faced this kind of social ostracism. In their own spaces, they didn't face that. And so ethnic identity for Indian and Pakistani immigrants during these years was especially thick. All right, I will leave it at that.
All right. Paul and Tori, first, thank you for putting this together and for bringing the three of us into dialogue. I'm really delighted to be here. So my work has been mostly in Mississippi, to a lesser extent in Georgia, and now I'm here in North Carolina. But the work in the book that Tori mentions, Scratching Out a Living, is about poultry workers in rural Mississippi. And so most of my research has been on this specific industry, but I think it's important to note that, and the population that I've studied are US born and new immigrant poultry workers who in Mississippi are from all across Latin America. So there are certainly Mexican workers, but also many indigenous folks from Guatemala, as well as other Central American countries, Nicaragua, Honduras, and also because this industry in Mississippi was recruiting from South Florida, they also have Cubans and Argentines and Uruguayans, Peruvians, so really folks from up and down the continent. And the reason that they came to the South is because there was work, right? There was work in an industry that welcomed them. And while my work focuses a lot on Mississippi, this is true across the South. Poultry has been one of the major drivers of Latin American migration into our region over the last 25 years at this point. So they were invited into this industry. They were recruited by this industry really to push out Black workers who were organizing. That was the biggest opportunity and the reason that people keep coming, right? Also, I think maybe Jennifer already mentioned, there's a low cost of living in the rural South, and that is appealing in terms of sort of cost benefit analysis. And folks will tell you that they felt like it was a safe place. The recruiters that they talked to in Miami said, you know, come to the rural South. Your kids won't get in trouble. We don't even sell beer here. Like, this is a good place for families, right? So especially folks from South America who had come with their families to Miami were drawn by the rurality and the sort of conservative nature of the South. And the other thing that folks told me back when I was beginning this work shortly after 9/11 was there was a much lower presence of immigration agents in the South. This was prior to the real rise of 287G and secure communities and the types of agreements between local and federal immigration, local police and federal immigration. But folks felt like, unlike in Chicago or Los Angeles or New York, they weren't likely to run into an immigration agent. So I think those are some of the benefits. There are a few challenges I wanted to mention. Some have been mentioned, so I'll just go over, sort of gloss over them. I think Uzma brought up sort of housing discrimination, and that's been a big problem in the research that I've done as well. People feeling, basically being told by white leadership in town that they're not welcome, sort of getting pushed out into really substandard housing or paying double, triple the cost of rent in order to have a place to live, being charged by the head and putting 12 or 15 people in a house. So there's a lot of exploitation and predatory practices by landlords for the prices of goods and services, sending money home, for example, and also obviously at work. So I think white supremacy is a real challenge. Also a lack of infrastructure and support for newcomers, right? By virtue of these being new receiving areas, they don't have still, and certainly didn't 20 years ago, and I think even still today, don't have the sort of rich services that are available in traditional receiving communities, and the even immigrants themselves who've been settled for a little longer, don't have the same sorts of roots and perhaps power or cultural connections that they might in other places. But the biggest thing that I want to bring up as a challenge here in the South is the question of undocumentation. And Jennifer talked about this in terms of local policing, which really started growing a lot after 9/11, 2006, 2007, 2008. We saw the South, more than any other part of the country, except maybe Arizona, really pushing these local federal agreements that made, as Jennifer pointed out, that made driving such a dangerous issue. But the other way that criminalization or that undocumentation comes up is in the question of undocumented work, right? So that the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act was the first time that undocumented work was criminalized in the US. And so it is not legal to knowingly hire someone without papers. And what this has done over the last 35 years is really push rather than punishing employers, it has pushed undocumented workers deep into the shadows. And things like E-Verify are just making folks so much more vulnerable, not just in the community, but also at work. And obviously, they're here to work, and the possibility of losing that job is, as Jennifer points out, instills a lot of fear and keeps people from exerting any sort of rights that they might have. So I'll stop there.
Terrific. Thanks to the three of you. You all have brought up some very interesting points that undoubtedly we'll keep talking about in the rest of it and in the Q&A, but let me move us in a slightly different direction with my next question. And my second question for the group is this: is there a uniquely Southern immigration story? When considering immigration, is the South exceptional, different, or does it dovetail with larger national or perhaps even global trends? Is there a uniquely Southern immigration story? Has this region encountered and dealt with immigration differently or similarly to other places in the US or outside of the US? So I'll kick that over to Jennifer first.
Thanks. So I'm going to cheat and say yes and no. I think that in some ways, the South has been part of a large scale shift nationally in that new migrants have settled in communities all over the United States that have never seen immigrants in large numbers. A lot of that driven by shifts in employment, as Angela has mentioned, poultry industry, not just in the South, but in places like Iowa, other kinds of shifts in agriculture, in manufacturing, have meant a lot of recruitment of immigrants across the board in lots and lots of places. We see more immigrants settling in the suburbs and rural towns now than we see in urban places. And so I think in some ways the South is part of a larger trend that's driven by kind of both pull factors in terms of economic opportunity, especially in the 1990s, 80s and 90s, and then also kind of push factors in that there was a lot of kind of instability in Latin America in particular, other issues in the Caribbean that meant the opportunities in the US were worth the risk of coming, even under the sort of regime in which undocumented status had more penalties than ever before. I think what makes the South different is what's always made the South a little bit different in that it is a region that's been characterized by kind of a rural urban landscape in many ways, right? So there's a lot of very small towns and rural areas in the South and a handful of large cities. And so that kind of the way in which that sort of geographical landscape can absorb immigrants is particular. It also is a Black-white region, as you mentioned, Tori, in the beginning. And I think that has played a huge role in how both the opportunities in terms of what that means and how people think about race and solidarity, but also a long history of enforcing white supremacy on the ground through law and through social practice that has been in some ways kind of shifted over to immigrants in lots of ways in the region. And I think that makes the South unique, not in that I want to suggest that the North or the Midwest or the West Coast lack white supremacy. That's hardly the case, but that the South has a particular kind of Black-white dynamic that I think translates in different ways and leads to different kinds of discourse around things like civil rights that resonate in different ways. It also has a very different labor history, which I'm sure Angela will talk about in terms of most states are right to work states. Unionization is not terribly common and is often difficult. And so that often is the place where you see multiracial coalitions form, and that has been difficult in the region. And so I think in some ways, I think place always matters. And so the South, even thinking about the South as a region is sometimes difficult. I think comparing Mississippi and North Carolina, as Angela knows, or Texas and Alabama, we would have completely different sort of social, legal, and political regimes around immigration. But I think it is important that we take into account the ways in which the South has changed very quickly, has seen the kind of growth that we haven't seen, since the beginning of the 20th century, and that is something that the rest of the United States should be paying attention to. And I feel like it was not until, this last election when everybody turned their heads towards Georgia for the first time in a long time that anyone took into account really what these transformations actually meant on the ground in terms of the kind of politics that were developing and the new kinds of demographic changes and opportunities that were arising in the region. And so in that sense, I think the South might be unique, but in a way that's influential now going forward with the rest of the country that we should be paying attention to. So I think I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleagues.
All right, Jennifer actually predicted my answer, which is to say you really can't give a yes or a no answer to this. It is yes and no. I think at various intervals, the South and its history, its immigration history, really coheres with the rest of the nation. In fact, Tori, you'd said in your opening comments that if you look at the South 50 years ago, there was a very small percentage of foreign-born population here, something like 1%. That's true, but 50 years ago puts us at 1970, And 1970 brings us out of a very long era of immigration restriction and exclusion. So if you push the needle back further, so that's just one moment, right, 1970. If you push the needle back even further and drop it down, say, in 1880 or 1890, the South actually is largely foreign-born, or at least there's a substantial foreign-born population. And if you push it back again even further, right, it becomes increasingly foreign-born. And we are now returning to that. You have, again, a large foreign-born population. So I think it really matters when the South is foreign-born, right? When exactly we're talking about. So in terms of regionally, the South's history, I would say it intertwines with US history, it mirrors US history, and in fact, the US broadly outside of the South enables Southern history, right? There was an article by Laura Edwards about a decade ago in the Journal of Southern History, and she comes down pretty strongly on the idea that the South itself is not an exceptional region of the United States historically, but historiographically it is, and culturally, sure, it has its own particularities. If we look at immigration, I think you could kind of see some of these same patterns. So if the South, through much of, I don't know, the 19th century, was largely European and African-American, forced African labor, then so was much of the rest of the United States. If you look at the South as a region in which Native Americans were dispossessed of their lands and pushed ever westward, then that mirrors the history of both the U.S. writ large, but also the western portion of the United States, especially. If you look at the history of the presence of Latinos, Latinas, the eastern portion of the United States differs quite a lot from the western side of the U.S., right? So I'm not sure that the South really is particular. There are regional differences elsewhere as well. And if you look at Asian Americans, then they actually were present in the South, perhaps not as early as the 1700s, but certainly in the 1800s with Chinese laborers. Moon Ho Jung's book, Coolies and Cane, there were Japanese rice farmers who settled in the South, and then Chinese who came in to work on the railroads and then stayed. So there actually is a history of their presence here. And if you look at labor, if Southern immigrants have largely, or historically, certainly up to the 20th century, largely been agricultural, there are other portions of the United States, US, which also have these strong agricultural historical traditions, right? And then if we fast forward to the very recent past, to the late 20th century, where the South has these hubs of high skills, high tech labor. Austin is a prime example of this. So do other parts of the United States, right? These H-1B workers both live in the South as well as everywhere else. So there's my complicated, messy answer.
Uzma, that's excellent. It's so great to hear your perspective, and there's so much nuance in your answer. I, like my colleagues, also felt that there's a yes and no answer to this question. I think in some ways, when I think about the places where I've done my work, well, first, I think there's not just, it's not just a question of regional context specific, but they're also local contexts, right? And I think in the case of poultry workers, this is a Southern story in the sense that that these new Latinx immigrants were recruited by a Southern industry, and an industry that selected and grew up in the South, not out of coincidence. So yet there is meatpacking across the country, but the top 5 poultry producing states are all in the deep South, and actually 8 out of the top 10 are. And as I mentioned before, industry has been really central to the recruitment of folks. And they picked the South because of entrenched poverty and the need of people's desperation to work. They picked it because of relatively infertile soil that had few alternative uses. They picked it because there was a mild climate, because it was rural, because in the case of this industry during World War II, there were a lot of women who were desperate for work when their partners were away. Also, in a later period, it was sharecroppers and domestic workers who really came, straight out of plantation capitalism into the chicken plants. And the South, of course, was courting these industries with tax breaks. There was a lot of regional boosterism and state and local subsidies. And as Jennifer noted, anti-labor legislation and sentiment is really big in the South. So weak or non-existent labor unions. I think these are all part of the story of low-wage immigrant work, at least in the South. But at the same time, I also write against the idea of Southern exceptionalism and sort of think about what this myth really does for the rest of the country. I think I was maybe telling Paul's class this yesterday, that I think when we perpetuate this idea that the South is uniquely racist, and it allows people in all of the other parts of the country to sort of look down their noses, right? Well, look, they're racist, we're not. Immigrants have a really hard time, or Black folks have a really hard time in the South, but not here where we are. Instead, I try to argue that in my work that I think looking at immigration in the South can be held up as a mirror for what's happening in the rest of the country, but perhaps with sort of magnifying properties. Maybe it's easier to see to some degree some things that are happening in this part of the country. I think that sort of exploitation that we see in low-wage immigrant work here in the South and in the poultry industry is happening in low-wage industries everywhere, right? Our food supply across the country is dependent on undocumented labor. And of course, the capitalist race to the bottom is a global trend, right? If we're talking, not even thinking nationally, but globally. I will say, if I have another second, that I think immigration lawyers might answer this question differently, because if we think about immigrant policing, it's been so much more virile in the South than in many other parts of the country. And also immigration courts in a lot of places in the South have much, much higher rates of deportation decisions than in other parts of the country. And that really comes down to individual judges, but also sort of a culture, an anti-immigrant culture. So there are certain, and that's not looking deep into history, but just sort of what's happening now and over the last 10 years or so. I think there are some pieces of the immigration story that perhaps, while not uniquely Southern, are again magnified, right, in this place.
Wonderful. Thanks, Angela, and the rest of you. Let me lob my third question at you all, and then we'll turn it open to a broader dialogue with the audience. And my third question is, how do you see immigrants globalizing the South? What sorts of consequences, expected or unexpected, are resulting from this globalization? Immigrants as the mediums of globalization and their consequences. So we'll go in the usual order.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, in that it's weird to me to say that it's kind of embedded in bodies in lots of ways, but there are new kinds of transnational relationships that I think maybe weren't imagined in the same way as they are possible now and are happening in the South. So and thinking about my work in North Carolina, I spent some time in Mexico in the sending communities where people were settling. In Winston-Salem, I went to some of their hometowns beforehand for a couple of months. And it was extraordinary to me how much people didn't know very much about the US as a whole, but they knew a whole lot about North Carolina and the towns that they were from. They knew they wore Tar Heel blue, and they knew about, particular kinds of towns and streets and basketball teams and things like that, that they had an ongoing relationship, that most of the mail that was coming in was from like particular towns and places, that there were now bus routes that went directly between kind of small towns in North Carolina and small towns in Mexico. And so there is now this kind of like circular process. And some of the, all of this is driven by those kind of economic relations, and and Mexico in particular relies very heavily on remittances. And so there are ways in which this is facilitated on both sides of the border. But the idea that we can somehow like turn off the spigot and turn back time and become kind of a provincialist, inward facing country, I think that ship has sailed. And the South, perhaps some of the political backlash is a result of realizing that the door has been swung wide open in ways that I think lots of people have found to be extraordinarily exciting and beneficial, certainly economically, also culturally and socially. But these kind of transnational relationships are now established and they're not going anywhere. It's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. And so I think that is now normative. I think now in any southern city that you go to, there's probably the closest bus station will have routes that take you directly to across the border to a town in which there are sort of economic relationships with. And I think that means that the South has to reckon with that, right? So there are ways in which maybe one of the differences between not the South and other regions, but the Southern landscape and, particular kind of traditional large scale receiving cities like Los Angeles is that cities tend to think of themselves as sort of global and cosmopolitan. And I think that there is a push to start to think about Southern cities in that way too, places like Austin and Nashville and Atlanta. But it is less embraced, I think, by the region as a whole. And I think that is something that is part of the struggle around immigration, is to try to reconcile these shifts. But they're here. And I think in ways that are like really also revitalizing to many communities. And there are lots and lots of small towns where people had left and there were no real opportunities. And now immigrants moving in have created a whole new set of entrepreneurial industries and things like that. And I think that the global South, not necessarily the region South, also is very much aware of the region as a whole. And so I think the ways that we think about the relationship between the US and the rest of the world is no longer about sort of New York, LA, and the global community. It's about all of these distinct spaces that now have changed dramatically as a result of immigrant settlement. In many ways, I think, for the better, but certainly with some growing pains. So I'm going to turn it over. I'm excited to hear what Uzma has to say because I love the historical context as well.
Me too. All right. So if we define globalization as the integration of global markets for land, labor, and capital, then for the group that I work on, and I'm going to confine my answer to this group because Jennifer and Angela speak so articulately to the other groups. I think that this process of globalization is most apparent through the rise of labor and capital. And traditionally, to be clear, labor refers to the working class, but the group of immigrants that I look at aren't working class. Actually, increasingly they are. They weren't working class in the 60s and 70s. Now they most certainly are. Indians and Pakistanis who migrate to the US and in many other parts of the world are very squarely working class. But in terms of this group in the 60s and 70s, what my research shows is that immigrants became increasingly vital, their labor became increasingly vital to the economies of those regions, but then also wherever these populations were clustered, were centered, became vital to the economies there. Their labor, this group were largely engineers, they were researchers, they were doctors, but their labor became absolutely necessary. And now you can look at any of those industries and see a large preponderance of Asian Americans in any one of them. They're vital, right? So you see that these regions, these clusters, and even the US broadly, becomes increasingly integrated into sort of a global brain drain or brain source, right? In a way that perhaps they hadn't before. In terms of capital, the very presence of these immigrants, regardless of class, their very presence generates a source of funding for these regions, right? So there is that interdependence, the bolstering of the Southern economy, if we can say there is such a thing, but the bolstering of wherever cities these folks are clustered in, it becomes dependent on their presence because it does create an increased tax base. They support the local economies through their purchases, their residents, all kinds of things. And then also these regions become linked globally because of the remittances that immigrants send back home, right? So in the case of Indians and Pakistanis, most recently, US Pakistanis sent over $1 billion to Pakistan from here. US Indians sent over $13 billion to India. And so you see that integration, these overseas countries become increasingly reliant, although the amount seems large. In fact, there's never been an instance of any foreign country that is suddenly uplifted into affluence by remittances. What happens is that these monies get filtered directly to the families that can be lifted in out of their certain circumstances, but it's not enough to uplift an entire economy. Nevertheless, there is that integration, I would say. And then in terms of how the South is globalizing, there's a really crude measure, right? The presence of an increasingly diverse presence of food, immigrant food, customs, ideas, art. But I would say that immigrant food, customs, ideas, art were present before the 20th century as well. We look at, again, the longer history of the South. As any newcomers settled in the South, they brought their customs and their food and whatnot with them. The South has long been immigrant. This is another phase of the region's immigration history, although there are a few cultural distinctions. And I think if I had to really nail down a dividing line of a before and an after, it'd be before the Civil War versus after the Civil War. And that is because the immigration that occurred before the Civil War and the settlers that settled across the South in the 18th and 19th centuries are probably more accurately classified as settler colonists and not as immigrants. I'm going to quote from Mahmoud Mamdani in his most recent work. He's a Ugandan anthropologist, historian. And here's a quote from his recent book. Whether immigrants seek equality or advantage, they come to join existing polities. Settlers come to displace existing polities and establish their own exclusive sovereignty. And so I think that when we talk about the long immigration history of the South, there needs to be a really clear understanding about recent immigrants who have settled what already exists versus those that came and displaced the existing population prior to the Civil War.
Absolutely.
I'll end with that.
I think that's really, really an important distinction. I want to talk about how young people from the 1.5 and second generation are growing up Southern. So when I began my work in the South 20 years ago, there were very few children who were, the children of immigrants were new immigrants as well. They were from the 1.5 generation and they were young. And one of the biggest struggles in Mississippi at the turn of the millennium was trying to figure out how to educate these kids and how to teach them English and meet the needs of these new families. But today, 20 years later, there are a lot of, these kids are growing up, right? And they are Southern and they feel fully Southern and fully American. And in North Carolina and Georgia and other parts of the deep South where new immigrants have been coming for a bit longer, there are even more young people who are coming of age, who are graduating from high school, who are you know, in many cases, really desperate to go to college, but when they're undocumented, they are being denied entrance in this, right, in the state of Georgia and South Carolina, prohibited from entering higher ed, and from in many of our other states being charged out of state tuition. So some are leaving the South in order to get educated. Some are not able to get educated and are working in low wage industries like their parents. I think that in our institutions of higher education, we're seeing these young people sort of coming out of the shadows and trying to claim space through, you know, Freedom University in Georgia, which is a patterned after Southern Freedom Schools. It's trying to educate young people, undocumented high college age students who can't get into school. Here at UNC, we've got an organization called Undocu Carolina that's trying to build space for these young people. There's a podcast that some of you might have heard, the Nuestro South podcast, which are young Latinx folks that they originally started by basically discussing historian Julie Wise's book about the longer history of Latin American folks in the region. So I think that it's not just changing the sort of the landscape of higher ed, but also politics, right? So in North Carolina, we just elected our first Latinx representative to the state house, which is really exciting. In other ways, when I think about immigrants globalizing the South, I see sort of this rich civil rights tradition that folks are both building off of, like in the case of Freedom University, but also and sort of a recognition by veterans of the civil rights movement that there are common struggles to be had, and a willingness to sort of work together across difference. I think that's a really important aspect of the ways in which sort of Southern freedom struggles are globalizing. Perhaps on a more cynical note, we've seen the real boom of immigrant detention centers across the South. And if we're thinking about globalization as, you know, economic and multinational sort of corporate integration into our region, this is one, I think, very dark way in which we're seeing sort of the consequences of this globalization, right? Is growing warehouses for policing immigrant bodies. So that's kind of, I shouldn't have left that for my last point, because it's an awfully dark way to think about the consequences of globalization, but that's my last point. So maybe we can open it up for Q&A.
Globalization is often a grim business, that's for sure. Well, thank you all so much for your illuminating answers. I want to transition to getting our audience involved as well. We've got one question in the chat from Avery. I'll call on you first, if that's okay. But as she's speaking, let me ask, if folks do have a question, what I recommend is that you just type a question mark into the chat. To signal that you have a question, just type a simple question mark into the chat, and then we'll get a sort of queue and order where folks can jump in, and you can ask questions of anyone or everyone on the panel if you wish. If you want to turn on your video when you're asking your questions, that would be terrific as well. But Avery, I saw you had the first shot here. Do you want to give it a go? Or maybe not. Anna Lynn, I see you got a question mark in the chat. You're welcome to go.
Yes, hi, my name's Anna. I've got a quick question. I work with Latino Spanish-speaking students at a center, and I was just kind of wondering, to what extent, like kind of what role do these students that are taking English courses, and especially in high school, in middle school, what role do they play in their families, kind of with that added advantage of speaking English, particularly in the South? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I can speak some to that. Oh, Jennifer, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead and start.
Well, I mentioned this initiative here at UNC on DocuCarolina that's trying to build a culture of belonging and resources for undocumented students in college. And one of the things that we do is lead trainings for administrators and faculty and staff on campus to learn about what it means to be undocumented. And we have students on our team who just speak about their own experiences and lives. And I don't think this is uniquely Southern at all, but they often talk about the burden that they have carried as children who either were the only people in their families who had papers. And so as they come of age, they're responsible for registering cars and buying houses, and but also just the weight that they carried from a very young age of being the only person, the bilingual person in their family, right? And so often having to negotiate on behalf of their parents and translate for their parents, and feel, I think, a lot of pressure to succeed and to do right by the dreams and sacrifices of their families, of their elders. It's a pretty heavy burden and a lot of maturity at a much younger age.
I would agree with everything that Angela said. I think the only thing I would add is that I think there's also an added political burden that young people feel they're facing. They may be as Angela said, the only ones in their families with papers are citizens, and are maybe more engaged politically or feel more empowered to be engaged politically because they have some protections. And so I think they also feel a lot of pressure to get out there and change kind of the political landscape. We didn't get into it too much, but I think Angela mentioned also the political context of the South is a little bit different than a lot of places, and it matters very much at a local level and at a state level what's happening, who the sheriffs are, who the city council is, who's in charge of the human resources, various aspects of that in each state, because they're in charge of providing services and access to lots of folks. So I think we're seeing now young people who speak English and who have, any sort of hold on feeling American, even if they don't have legal status, to be much more engaged on behalf of their parents to sort of secure a space in their communities and to get people elected to various offices where they have a lot more ability to live and work without fear.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
I wanted
Avery,
to,
did you
yes,
jump in?
I was here, but I thought it was going to get answered. I didn't know I was supposed to read it. So I'm sorry. So I come from the perspective of being an immigrant. So I was born, I came here for college. Long story short, went through the whole immigration system, and now I'm a citizen. And by the way, it's not as easy as people say. It took 20 years following the legal path. And I also bought into the myth because, as an immigrant, I didn't know that in the South, it's worse, like in terms of racism and being targeted and that sort of stuff, than in the North, until I lived in the North, and it was horrible. But I do think that myth is pretty prevalent in this country, because I've had friends in the North say I could never live in the South. And I'm thinking, if we think of racism as a people problem, then we'll never truly solve it. If we think of it as a systematic problem, where the system itself needs to be changed, then we may have a better stab at it. Because that mindset of people saying, like, people who would do and say racist things to me would say I could never live in the South. And I'm like, it's all over. And to that point, and so it was something you said, Angela, that made me think of that. And it might be because there's, and I don't know the stats on this, so that's why I was kind of asking, stating at the same time, is it that because in the South, maybe a greater population of minorities might exist, why it seems like it's more prolific here? But, you know, if you have more people to oppress, then it may seem like it's more oppressive in that area. And I don't know that. So that's why I was kind of asking, making a statement at the same time.
I have to apologize. I think violin practice just started in the room below me. So if you can hear some screeching violins, I apologize. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this, and it's good to hear from your own personal experience. I think there's a greater percentage of African-American folks in most Southern states than in other states. But I think that you're onto something when you say, you know, this is not a people problem, this is a systems problem, or structures. I can't remember which word you used. I think you're right. I think that a lot of people who hold this idea that it's worse in the South think about racism as interpersonal discrimination. But I believe that racism, and this is not my belief, this is, critical race theory. I believe that racism is structural, that it's embedded in our systems, in our institutions, in our colorblind, quote unquote, colorblind policies. And if we look at racism in that way, right, what are the the disproportionate outcomes that result from policy and practice, then we can see clearly that white supremacy is a guiding sort of ideology across the country. But I would love to hear what other panelists have to say about this.
I'll piggyback on what you just said, Angela, and to obviously be in agreement with you rather. But that if racism is indeed a structural problem, which it is, and we think about racism towards immigrants, sort of with a lowercase r, racist acts towards immigrants or attitudes towards immigrants, that is rooted in immigration policy, or I should say anti-immigrant policy, right? And as long as there is this entire architecture of immigration policy that denies access, that is as you mentioned, I forget your name, Avery, as you mentioned, how difficult it is to actually enter the U.S. By following the process as it's laid down. As long as that is the case, we're going to continue seeing these attitudes against immigration. I mean, it's a complicated problem to tackle, but individuals changing their behavior is not going to change. Is not going to provide us with a solution. This does need to be tackled at a policy level, and only then, I think many of us would agree, only then do individual attitudes change. But structurally, it must be changed first.
If I could just piggyback real quickly on the idea of policy, I agree with everything my colleagues have said. And Avery, I think your question comes from like the most accurate intuition possible, which is, of course, there's not less racism in the North than there is in the South. I think there are different tools that people have for enforcing white supremacy in different places. And so, one thing that comes to mind in thinking about the South is like, Black people think about Atlanta as a Black metropolis in which Black people actually have power and some tools to stop some of the kind of white supremacist frameworks and institutional policies that exist for the first time in the last, a few decades than they have in many years. And that has created an exodus of people to Atlanta and a lot of engagement in that space as a place where race is actually addressed through a number of means, and interpersonal racism is very different than it is in other places. I think maybe what might set the North apart is that there have been the South has had more tools to prevent people of color from getting power in political institutions. And so that has meant the ability to pass policies that are punitive and to prevent policies that are useful and receptive or expand the welfare state to people who are immigrants or who are newcomers or who are Black Americans or Native Americans and others from gaining access. And to the extent that there are places in other parts of the country where non-whites have gained a little bit of power, they're able to do more work to prevent those sort of punitive policies from happening. But I think that's like a very broad strokes way of looking at the South. I think there are individual states in which we see a huge amount of change around politics. But in terms of like everyday attitudes and investment in white supremacy, that is deeply embedded in the workings of the state. And there's nothing about being in New York or Chicago or LA that prevents you from having those kinds of experiences. As Uzma mentioned early on, right? We're seeing Asian Americans being attacked in Oakland, California. We've seen a number of cases in which Black people have been killed in St. Louis and in New York. So this is not a Southern problem. And to the extent, as Angela said, that we continue to talk about it this way, it only absolves people incorrectly from doing the important work that needs to be done on the ground to make change.
Bob, you were in line with a question.
Yeah, my name's Bob Hutton. I work with Tori in the UT history department. I've really enjoyed everything I've heard so far. And earlier on, I did hear someone mention, I forget which panelists mentioned this, but the fact of the South being a fundamentally rural region. And that's, less true now than it ever has been. The South is far more urbanized and suburbanized than it was in, let's say, 1970, the year that people keep throwing out. Would any of y'all care to comment about the experience of immigrants in the South in, let's say, urban areas versus rural areas? And then, of course, there's the more common situation of places that are neither entirely urban. I'm thinking, for instance, like, say, Gainesville, Georgia, or many of the towns outside of Chapel Hill, like, for instance, say, Fuquay-Varina, towns that are somewhat ex-urban, but they've become very well known as being sort of a center point for immigrants. Homemaking and in relatively large numbers. Do you see that as kind of a major factor? Because it's really important to understand the South today as a place that's no more rural than most of the Northeast in terms of where people live. What do you think?
I mean, I can speak to the urban South and using obviously Houston as a case study, but also I think this applies to other large cities in the South as well. I think what you see as immigrants settle in the South is they settle in very particular ways because Southern cities, as you mentioned, Bob, because Southern cities have expanded largely in the recent past, as opposed to being 300 years old. They've expanded in very particular ways. The ways that they've expanded are due to suburbanization, and they are very developer driven. And what that means is that the residential patterns across urban areas fracture along race and class lines. And so suburban neighborhoods are targeted to certain income levels, and often that aligns a little too neatly, actually, with racial lines. And so if you look at, I've done some of this work with GIS mapping, and so if you look at urban areas and you zoom out and you trace that over time, what you see is that there isn't just kind of immigrant ethnic clustering, but that immigrants of differing class backgrounds cluster in specific areas, right? So that what we have is, yes, we have a South that is urban, but that urban structure doesn't necessarily dismantle racial segregation. In fact, it simply replicates it.
I guess I would only add just very briefly in thinking about smaller towns, which is kind of where my research is I'm not sure that there is I don't think the patterns exist necessarily between, as Uzma said, like what happens in urban places versus what happens in rural places, but rather the composition of those spaces themselves. In some ways, immigrants have been part of the exurbs expansion, right? That people have, immigrants have been part of that movement to the sort of outer ring, creating outer ring suburbs because of new developments and opportunities for lower cost living or home ownership that didn't exist in cities for them, or in spaces that they felt were kind of safe and advantageous for their children. And then there's also the factor of like being a newcomer sometimes means that you have limited knowledge and understanding of the places that you're going. So you may be targeting a town simply because of the labor market opportunities there with very little other knowledge of the space. And so I imagine that these places will continue to change quite a bit over the next 20 years or so. As Angela mentioned, right, youth are coming into adulthood and think of themselves as Southern and have different ideas of residency. In my work, I find that like whether or not there are other non-whites present is really the thing that changes the experience, more so than whether or not it's a rural or urban location. And then to some extent, whether or not anyone in those cities has decided that they want to engage in welcoming politics or not, right? So if they want to translate policies for local residents, if they want to do outreach, if they're working with local businesses to try to make sure that services are available to those who are newcomers, that's what really changes the experience more so than whether it's an urban or rural environment, I think. And I think you're right, the South is also changing like lots of places very quickly because of, you know, shifting economic reasons. So I think a lot of this is speculation on my part and not necessarily the ability to say for certain what the difference is in the long run between those kinds of spaces.
Uzma, you put a question mark in the chat. Do you want to pose a question of your fellow panelists?
I would like to pose a question.
Please.
I have a question for Angela. I was wondering if you find it helpful to compare poultry working industry, or should the poultry industry in the South with that of Minneapolis. Is that a useful comparison? And if so, what have you found to be the differences?
I have not made that comparison, actually. Yeah, that would be fascinating. My suspicion would be that in Minneapolis, they are probably employing, relying heavily on Somali refugee populations.
Yes, I should have clarified. That's exactly why I'm asking, because there is a sizable immigrant concentration in poultry in Minneapolis, and they are Somali. So I was wondering if you could kind of compare the two.
There are some parts of the South that have moved to supplement, I guess, U.S.-born and undocumented labor with refugee groups in Arkansas, Laotians and Marshallese, and in Alabama, actually, there's some population of Somali workers. But I don't know much at all about what's happening in Minnesota, and I don't know of any organizing of those workers. But I'd be delighted to make any connections if you know anything about what's happening up there.
Okay, well, we'll follow up, I guess, privately. But no, I don't know a lot. This is way outside my area of research. But I was just wondering if it would be useful to compare the South, essentially a poultry industry in the South, with one that's outside of the South. That might shed some light on something. Right.
Well, I think what little I know of Minnesota is that there are a lot more protections and labor protections and social programs than the places that I'm more familiar with. So I think that would be an interesting comparison. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
There's a question from Chloe Kinzer. Chloe, do you want to pose one?
Hi, I'm Chloe Kinzer. I just had a question based off of Avery's post before she had responded, but it got answered, so thank you.
Sure thing. Paul.
Thanks. Yeah, this has been really interesting. I wanted to actually hear a few more comments or ask any of you to elaborate a bit more on we've talked a lot about immigration and labor and then globalization coming in, and it just, what I caught from particularly from Uzma, but from all three of you was a really nice sort of class nuanced way of thinking about globalization and its intersections with immigration. Like Jennifer, when you were talking about cities' senses of being global and of being cosmopolitan, it struck me that, well, maybe cities don't want to be identified as global and cosmopolitan if most of the new immigrants are working class as opposed to professional class or others. And I thought that might be interesting in contrast to Uzma. For Uzma, I was kind of curious, can we measure in remittances any distinction between small scale remittances or capital flow remittances? Is there any way to capture whether any of that's happening? Because I guess for me, it's wrapped up also in a bigger question, which is the position of the US, right? Modi came to the US and there's this huge following of the Hindutva amongst the Indian Americans. And I just sort of wonder, I mean, I feel like there's, just like there are mistaken assumptions about the South as being more racist, I feel there are sometimes mistaken assumptions about immigrants being more tolerant of other immigrants or of taking more liberal or progressive political positions. And I wondered how all of that might relate to the bigger question, which I see, which is the US being in a period of hegemonic decline, that maybe this is related to the theme of the next panel, increasing criminalization of immigrants, because we're in this situation of tension and inequality and uncertainty about where the US is going. So there's a bunch of questions sort of bubbling in my head. I guess I leave it to you how you choose to address it, but I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I'll be quick because I think I have less to say on this than other things. I think the idea of a global cosmopolitan city is reliant on immigrant settlement that's happened across generations, but also across class background. So I think in some ways, I mean, this isn't just true in the US, right? We would think of like London as a global city or, you know, Singapore as a global city state. So there are ways in which this is part of establishing oneself on a kind of global scale as a center of finance and commerce, but also kind of in welcoming of international business, as well as having sort of immigrant enclaves and ethnic foods and culture and all of these things. So I think it's not so much that there's a lack of working class immigrants, but rather that there's also a huge capital flow at the top as well. And that it is a particular kind of way of centering oneself in a global marketplace that I think we may see more from cities like Atlanta, I think in the future as they become more globalized. I think Houston is already making these kinds of claims. And so I think that comes from these sort of multi-generational processes. And I wanted to like maybe put a pin in the question of whether the US is in decline. I think that's an open question. I think it's in a state of flux, and that is primarily because it is in a position where we are now, like, demographic change is real, it is obvious, and there are a lot of people making demands on the state to make good on its, democratic promises from generations before. And I think whether or not we move in the direction of opening those doors or closing them is kind of on the table. And there's a lot of struggle that's going to continue to happen over that. But whether or not that results in decline, I mean, I suppose it depends on how you measure decline. If we think about it as sort of like expanded democracy in the welfare state versus expanded economies, that's a different kind of question. But I think I'm not sure that decline is inevitable if I'm thinking about it in the former way, but I do think that there's going to be a lot of struggle over what that looks like and for whom in the next couple of decades.
Yeah, absolutely. I would add, I guess, a couple of things, because that your question / comments raised so many important issues. I'll try and answer this in some kind of a coherent way. You mentioned the cosmopolitan city and sort of the rise of of that idea. I think that actually, I think immigrants and others define that differently. So that idea actually comes up in the oral history interviews that I've conducted, where these highly educated immigrants from India and Pakistan, they settle in the US and they experience, a couple of different cities. They may not come directly to Houston. They may live in New York. One of the interviews that I conducted, this family had lived in New York for 15 years, and then they came to Houston. They regarded New York as a cosmopolitan city, but Houston much less so. And for them, that really turned on the level of diversity. And by that, I mean sort of racial, ethnic, and class diversity. And they couldn't visually see that in Houston in 1975. So for them, Houston was not a cosmopolitan city, but to those same individuals, Houston today is a cosmopolitan city. So for immigrants, cosmopolitanism perhaps rests largely on diversity and what that brings, that kind of heterogeneity. I think for perhaps native-born Houstonians a generation ago, cosmopolitanism didn't rest on that. It rested on their definition of culture, which is things like fine arts museums. So it's a very different definition, understanding of what cosmopolitanism means. When you mentioned, and then to move on without a really seamless transition, but to move to another point that you raised with regard to the US versus India and the rise of political figures like Modi. Well, we have the rise of our own political figures like Modi, right? We don't need to look to India for that. We see it here, we see it with Trump. And so that kind of reactionary populist politics that is increasing, obviously here, we've seen it already. We see it in Europe. It's not unique to the United States. We do see it in India as well. I mean, a lot of it has to do, in terms of India, it has to do with this sort of spread of neoliberalism and the centering of the market, the sanctity of the individual, these kinds of ideas that people are reacting against, right? Much of our own politics in the last 40 years have been a reaction specifically to the civil rights movement and the rights accorded to groups that up until that point had been denied those rights. So we're still, as a country, still reacting to that. So yeah, I will end it at that and hand it off to Angela if she wants to add something onto it.
Thanks, everyone. Great comments, and I think we're running out of time, so I won't respond further, but I look forward to continuing conversations.
Well, please join me in a big round of applause for our three distinguished speakers, as loud as a Zoom applause can get. Thank you all for joining us in the audience, to our visitors. I really enjoyed this conversation. Let's keep it going. We'll be continuing in this forum in March, talking about the criminalization of immigration with a group of folks who are very much involved on the ground with these issues. So please stick around, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks again to Angela, Uzma, and Jennifer for coming. Have a terrific week.
Thanks so much for having us. Really appreciated it.
You bet.
Thanks, everyone. It was great.
Thank you.